For over 110 years, the story of RMS Titanic has been told and retold. The unsinkable ship struck an iceberg on its maiden voyage and sank in the frigid North Atlantic on April 15, 1912, taking 1,517 lives with it. The narrative has been studied, filmed, romanticized, and debated by historians, engineers, and survivors until it became one of the most documented disasters in human history. We thought we knew everything. The iceberg collision, the insufficient lifeboats, the band playing as the ship went down, the wealthy and poor divided by class, even in death, the heroism, the cowardice, the human drama played out against the backdrop of technological hubris. But in 2024, a team of scientists, deep-sea engineers, and forensic analysts deployed the most advanced three-dimensional scanning technology ever used on an underwater wreck site. They spent months mapping every square inch of Titanic's remains, lying nearly 4,000 meters beneath the Atlantic surface. And what they discovered has fundamentally changed our understanding of what happened that night. Because the new scans revealed something that contradicts everything the movie showed us, everything the official inquiries concluded, and everything we've believed for over a century about how Titanic died. The ship didn't break apart in one dramatic snap, the way we've seen in films. It tore itself apart slowly, violently, over the course of minutes, in a structural failure so catastrophic that the stern section essentially destroyed itself during the descent to the seafloor. The iceberg didn't rip a massive gash in the hull. It created a series of thin slits, death by 1,000 cuts, that breached 6 watertight compartments, when the ship was designed to survive flooding in only 4. And, most significantly, the scans found evidence that changes the story of who the real heroes were that night. Not just the band, not just the officers who went down with the ship, but the engineers and stokers deep in the engine rooms who stayed at their posts in hell itself to keep the lights burning and the pumps running, buying precious minutes that may have saved hundreds of lives. This is the story of what the new Titanic discovery revealed, the forensic evidence from 3,800 meters down, and the disturbing truth about what really happened in the final moments of the most famous ship in history. Before we go any further, please subscribe to our channel and help us reach our goal of 1,000 subscribers. Now, let's examine what the new Titanic scans actually revealed. The wreck of RMS Titanic was discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard and his team at a depth of approximately 3,800 meters, 12,500 feet, in the North Atlantic, about 370 miles south-southeast of Newfoundland. The wreck is split into 2 main sections, the bow and the stern, lying about 600 meters apart, surrounded by a massive debris field spanning roughly 5 square kilometers. For decades, exploring the wreck meant sending down manned submersibles or remotely operated vehicles that could capture limited footage and still images. Each expedition added pieces to the puzzle, but the extreme depth, the pitch darkness, and the dangerous currents made comprehensive mapping impossible. But in 2022, a collaboration between deep-sea mapping specialists, forensic engineers, and documentary production teams launched the most ambitious Titanic survey ever attempted. The goal was not just to film the wreck, it was to create a complete digital twin of the entire site with millimeter-level precision. The technology deployed was unprecedented. Remotely operated vehicles, equipped with the latest generation of high-resolution cameras, LiDAR scanners, and sonar mapping systems, descended to the wreck and systematically photographed every accessible surface from multiple angles. The ROVs operated in coordinated patterns, ensuring complete coverage with no blind spots. Over the course of multiple expeditions spanning several months, the team captured over 700,000 individual images. These were not casual snapshots. Each image was geo-referenced, time-stamped, and captured with overlapping coverage to ensure accurate three-dimensional reconstruction. The data collected amounted to over 16 terabytes of visual and spatial information. Advanced photogrammetry software then processed these images, identifying common points across thousands of photographs, and using them to construct a three-dimensional model. The result was a detailed digital twin of the Titanic wreck. A virtual recreation so detailed that researchers could examine rivet patterns, measure deck plates, analyze structural failures, and trace the debris field with unprecedented accuracy. For the first time in history, scientists could walk through Titanic without descending 3,800 meters into the Atlantic. They could rotate the model, zoom in on specific damage, compare structural elements, and analyze the wreck site as if it were a crime scene rather than a historical curiosity. And when they began that analysis, the first thing that became strikingly clear was the dramatic difference between the bow and stern sections. The bow section of Titanic, which contains the first 450 feet of the ship, including the bridge, forecastle, and forward cargo holds, is remarkably intact. It sits upright on the seafloor, tilted slightly to port, looking almost majestic despite over a century underwater. The railings are still visible. The anchors remain in place. The bridge structure, though collapsed, is recognizable. From certain angles you can still see what the ship Titanic once was. But the stern section tells a completely different story. It is a twisted, mangled wreck that barely resembles a ship at all. The entire aft portion, roughly 200 feet of Titanic's stern, including the propellers, rudder, and poop deck, is collapsed in on itself. Decks are pancaked together. Steel plates are bent at impossible angles. The structure has been compressed, folded, and shattered, as if some force crushed it from above. For decades, researchers assumed this damage occurred when the stern hit the seafloor after Titanic broke apart. But the new 3D scans revealed something different. The damage patterns do not match a sudden impact. They match progressive structural failure, the stern destroying itself during the descent. The debris field between the bow and stern sections provided the crucial evidence. The scans captured thousands of individual pieces of wreckage, hull plates, deck structures, machinery, furniture, and personal belongings. By mapping the exact position and orientation of each piece, researchers could reconstruct the sequence of events during Titanic's final moments. What they discovered was that the breakup was not a single catastrophic snap. It was a slow, violent structural failure that began near the third funnel and propagated both forward and aft as the ship's keel twisted under impossible stress. As Titanic's bow filled with water and tilted downward, the stern section rose higher and higher out of the water. This created tremendous stress on the middle of the ship, the weakest point structurally, where expansion joints were designed to allow the ship to flex in waves. But these joints were never designed to handle the extreme angles and forces created by one end of the ship being underwater, while the other stood nearly vertical. The keel began to bend. The hull plates started separating. The decks began tearing. This was not a clean break. It was structural disintegration. Steel twisted, rivets popped, and the ship literally tore itself apart over the course of several minutes. When the bow finally separated and began its descent to the seafloor, the stern suddenly released from the weight pulling it down, actually settled back somewhat in the water. Survivors reported seeing the stern appear to right itself briefly before beginning its own final plunge. But here is what the scans revealed that changed everything. The stern was already structurally compromised when it began sinking. The breakup had left it weak, fractured, and unstable. And as it descended into the deep ocean, The increasing water pressure found every weakness, every crack, every compromised joint. The stern imploded during descent, decks collapsed inward, compartments crushed. The entire structure folded in on itself as water pressure squeezed it like a tin can. By the time it reached the seafloor, the stern, suddenly released from the weight pulling it down, actually settled back somewhat in the water. Survivors reported seeing the stern appear to right itself briefly before beginning its own final plunge. But here is what the scans revealed that changed everything. The stern was already structurally compromised when it began sinking. The breakup had left it weak, fractured, and unstable. And as it descended into the deep ocean, the increasing water pressure found every weakness, every crack, every compromised joint. The stern imploded during descent. Decks collapsed inward, compartments crushed. The entire structure folded in on itself as water pressure squeezed it like a tin can. By the time it reached the seafloor, the stern section had been utterly destroyed, not by the impact, but by the descent itself. This explained what had puzzled researchers for decades, why the stern was so much more damaged than the bow. The bow sank relatively intact, its compartments already flooded, descending smoothly to the bottom. But the stern sank as a compromised structure, filled with air pockets, and the ocean crushed it mercilessly during the 2.5-mile journey down. For over a century, the sinking of Titanic has been visualized a certain way. Movies showed the ship tilting dramatically, then breaking cleanly in two with a thunderous snap before the separated sections slid into the ocean. It is dramatic, it is cinematic, and according to the new forensic analysis, it is wrong. The three-dimensional scan data shows that the breakup was gradual, progressive, and far more violent than any film has depicted. The ship did not snap. It twisted, bent, folded, and eventually tore apart over several minutes of structural torture. Evidence from the debris field shows hull plates that were bent outward, not sheared cleanly. Deck structures pulled apart rather than breaking. Keel sections twisted before separating. This is the signature of progressive failure, not sudden fracture. Survivors who witnessed the sinking from lifeboats described seeing the ship's lights go out in sections as the breakup occurred. They reported hearing explosions that were likely boilers bursting or compartments imploding as structural failure propagated through the ship. Some described seeing the ship bend in the middle before finally separating. For decades, these accounts were treated skeptically. How could people in the darkness, hundreds of yards away, in a state of shock, accurately describe structural mechanics? Surely their memories were unreliable, traumatized, confused. But the forensic evidence from the three-dimensional scans validates those eyewitness accounts. The survivors were right. The ship did bend. It did break apart gradually. The lights did go out in sections. What seemed like impossible detail from traumatized witnesses turns out to be accurate observation. This validation of survivor testimony has profound implications. If the eyewitnesses were right about the breakup, they were likely right about other details that have been questioned or dismissed over the decades. And one of the most significant details they remembered was that the lights stayed on long into the disaster, far longer than should have been possible given the flooding and the angle of the ship, which brings us to the real heroes of Titanic. Not the passengers, not the officers, but the men who stayed in hell to keep everyone else alive. When Titanic struck the iceberg at 11:40 p.m. on April 14, 1912, the ship's engineering crew, stokers, trimmers, engineers, electricians, and firemen were working deep in the bowels of the ship. In the boiler rooms, the engine rooms, the electrical generator spaces, these were the hottest, loudest, most dangerous parts of the vessel, even under normal circumstances. When the iceberg damage began flooding the forward compartments, these men didn't evacuate. They stayed at their posts, and the three-dimensional scans provide physical evidence of exactly what they did in those final hours. The scans revealed open steam valves in position suggesting manual operation during the sinking, electrical junction boxes with fused wiring indicating severe overload, generator equipment positioned as if it had been kept running until the very last moment, boiler room furnace doors left open in configurations suggesting the fires were being stoked even as water rushed in. This physical evidence, combined with survivor testimony and the historical record, paints a clear picture. The engineering crew deliberately kept Titanic's power systems running as long as physically possible. Why does this matter? Because every minute those lights stayed on potentially saved lives. Titanic's electrical system powered everything critical during the evacuation. The deck lighting that let passengers and crew see in the pitch-black North Atlantic night. The davit motors that lowered the lifeboats. The wireless transmitter that sent distress signals. And, critically, the pumps that slowed, even if they could not stop, the flooding in various compartments. Survivors repeatedly mentioned in their testimony that the lights stayed on until very late into the disaster. Some reported seeing lights still burning even as the ship broke apart. This seemed impossible, given the flooding and the extreme angle of the ship. Surely the generators would have been swamped, the electrical systems short-circuited, and power lost early in the sinking. But the forensic evidence from the wreck suggests otherwise. The engineering crew kept those systems running through heroic effort and sacrifice. When flooding threatened one boiler room, they shifted operations to another. When generators were at risk, they manually rerouted power. When circuits overloaded from the ship's tilting angle, causing electrical malfunctions, they bypassed safety systems to keep electricity flowing. These men knew they were going to die. The engine rooms and boiler spaces were deep in the ship, far from the lifeboats. By the time evacuation was ordered for passengers, it was already too late for most of the engineering crew to reach the boat deck. And even if they could have, they knew what would happen if they abandoned their posts. The lights would go out, panic would intensify, and the evacuation would descend into chaos. So, they stayed. In spaces that were flooding, heating up from fires they had to keep burning, filling with steam from burst pipes. They stayed until the water reached them, until the steam scalded them, until the rising ocean finally silenced the generators and extinguished the furnaces. Evidence from the wreck shows that some engineering spaces remained operational until the ship was already breaking apart. The electrical systems did not fail gradually. They were cut off suddenly when seawater finally overwhelmed the generators, suggesting the crew kept them running literally until the last possible second. How many lives did this buy? Conservative estimates suggest that if the lights had gone out an hour earlier, panic would have made the evacuation far more chaotic. Lifeboats might have been launched partially filled, or not at all. People might have been trampled in darkness. The orderly evacuation that characterized Titanic's sinking, relative to the chaos it could have been, was enabled by the engineering crew's sacrifice. Even an extra 10 or 15 minutes of light and power could have meant the difference between life and death for dozens or hundreds of people. Every lifeboat that was successfully lowered, every distress signal sent, every passenger who found their way to the boat deck, in the darkness, all of it was possible because men deep in the ship chose to die so others might live. Of the approximately 900 crew members aboard Titanic, only about 212 survived. Of the engineering department's 325 men, only 48 survived, a survival rate of less than 15%, compared to about 24% for crew overall and about 38% for passengers. These were not just statistics. These were men with names, families, and lives. Joseph Bell, chief engineer, who organized his men to keep the systems running. Jonathan Shepard, Junior Assistant Second Engineer, age 23. Herbert Harvey, Junior Second Engineer, who reportedly was standing waist-deep in water when last seen, still at his post. William Farquharson, Senior Second Engineer, who was responsible for maintaining electrical power throughout the ship. The 3D scans cannot tell us their final moments, but the evidence of open valves, positioned equipment, and operating systems that should not still have been running provides physical testimony to their sacrifice. When people talk about Titanic's heroes, they mention Captain Smith going down with his ship, or Wallace Hartley's band playing as the ship sank, or the officers who maintained order during evacuation. All true, and all deserving of recognition. But the engineering crew, the men whose names most people do not know, whose jobs were not glamorous, whose final moments were spent in darkness and steam and rising water, far from the glory of the boat deck, were the ones who gave everyone else a chance. The 3D scans revealed another crucial detail about why Titanic sank so quickly and so completely: the nature of the iceberg damage. For over a century, popular imagination pictured the iceberg tearing a massive gash in Titanic's hull, a long, continuous wound that allowed the ocean to pour in. When the wreck was first discovered and examined, researchers found something different. There was no single gash. The damage was much more subtle and more deadly. The new 3D scans provided the most detailed view yet of how the iceberg actually damaged the ship. And what they show is 1,000 cuts. The iceberg did not rip open the hull. It created a series of thin slits, narrow separations where hull plates pulled apart or rivets popped under the impact.